Welcome back to this third and final video on the urinary system. I'd like to summarize how urine is formed, and in doing so present the structure of the nephron one more time. I've pre-drawn it on the board, and anytime you get a diagram where there's multiple parts that can be labeled, it's worth going around the diagram and naming the parts and just reviewing what their functions are. So looking at the blood part first, afferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole brings the blood in to the glomerulus. This is the glomerulus here. I'll just number the parts. The efferent arteriole. The efferent arteriole takes the blood out of the glomerulus. Notice that these three parts of blood vessels so far, they're arterioles. There aren't any capillaries yet, although these are very capillary-like. They're very delicate down here, but they're not quite capillaries yet. The capillary bed surrounds the loop of Henle, so we have a fourth part of the circulatory system here. Sometimes these are called the peritubular capillaries, but the capillaries wrap around here and the exchange occurs between the tissue spaces and the capillaries. And we have the blood vessel which takes blood out of this area, and it'll be the renal venule, but it'll lead to a renal vein. So those are the blood vessel parts of the story here. The nephron parts, I'll label them with a different color. We have this structure here, which is the glomerulus, the Bowmans capsule. We have the proximal convoluted tubule. The Bowmans capsule surrounds the glomerulus, remember, and it's that association which collects up the materials once they're pushed out of the circulatory system, so they enter into the nephron structure here. We travel through the proximal convoluted tubule, and this is where the sugars and the water starts to get reabsorbed. A little bit of water, a little bit of ions. Most of the water gets reabsorbed in the descending portion of the loop of Henle, because these cells are specialized with proteins that allow water out, and this has a high sodium concentration in the medullary region of the nephron, of the kidney. Ascending side, on the ascending side, it's still the loop of Henle. The ascending side is where the sodium is removed. So it becomes very salty down here, but less salty, isotonic with the proximal convoluted tubule. Here we have the distal convoluted tubule, we'll call that number 9. And this is where the tubular excretion, tubular secretion occurs to adjust the pH of blood and get rid of things like penicillin and other proteins that have been produced in the body. This is the collecting duct. And the collecting duct collects up urine as it's being formed from different nephrons and takes it down to the renal pelvis. So there you have, there's the diagram, 10 parts, and it's worth knowing all 10 parts and their functions. But it's a little bit simplified this way because it's never laid out nice and flat like it's been rolled over with a rolling pin. This is a twisted tubule, and a more accurate picture of it may look something like this if I use this side over here where we have a distal convoluted tubule, a loop of Henle, but the loop of Henle could actually wrap backwards this way, and Bowmans capsule can be associated with a proximal convoluted tubule up here, and Bowmans capsule can be like this. So you get the same sort of thing, but it's twisted back on itself. And a little bit later on in this video, I'll mention the importance of the proximity of the distal convoluted tubule to Bowmans capsule and the blood vessels that come in and take blood out of Bowmans capsule. So with this, we have to recognize as well that the processes that go on, the water gets reabsorbed and everything else, are all designed to keep your body healthy. The only thing is that your body's needs aren't constant, and you have to have a way to make adjustments to how much urine is being formed and so on. So just for example, if you're really dehydrated, you're not going to be generating a lot of urine because you can't afford to lose that water. Another instance that we've recognized already is diabetics can't move the sugar. So if sugar, glucose, is supposed to be recovered from the proximal convoluted tubule into the blood vessels there, and diabetics because they don't have insulin, they can't do that effectively. So without the insulin, sugar just doesn't simply get moved. So they wind up with sugar remaining in the urine. And consequently, they have large urine flows to dilute that urine, or to dilute the urine, that's right. And that's what we recognize as a diuretic. Something which is a diuretic increases urine flows. Having said diuretic though, we have a hormone, and that's where we have to be able to make these adjustments. There is a hormone called ADH. ADH stands for antidiuretic. Hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is produced in the hypothalamus and released from the posterior pituitary gland. So what happens in your system is that the blood's going through your brain, and as the hypothalamus tissue recognizes that, wait a minute, this blood hasn't got enough volume in it, that means there's been too much urine being produced, then the antidiuretic hormone gets released, and antidiuretic hormone affects protein channels along the collecting duct. And it opens up these protein channels so additional water can get removed. If additional water gets removed, then you get less urine being produced. So antidiuretic hormone reduces urine production. Remember now, a diuretic increases urine flows. Antidiuretic reduces urine production, reduces urine. There are a couple other diuretics that are worth mentioning. One of them is alcohol. Alcohol inhibits ADH production. So as a result, if you're inhibiting ADH production, you will actually wind up increasing urine production. Another one is coffee. Coffee increases blood volume, and you wind up with a greater amount of filtration, a greater amount of urine being produced that way. So those two things are diuretics. They increase urine flows. It's always very interesting to recognize the ADH, for example, as a hormone, brings you back to a condition of homeostasis. And I'd like to represent that pattern for you in the way of a feedback loop. If we recognize what's going on with ADH, if you have what happens is low blood volume, is the condition which is detected by the hypothalamus. The response by the hypothalamus is to increase ADH concentration, cause the release of ADH, and ADH reduces urine flow or urine production. These two things are opposite. Those two things are opposite. Low blood volume results in less urine being produced, which would effectively increase blood volume. This is a negative feedback loop, and it's worth mentioning here because this is a really simple example of a hormone and how it plays a role as a negative feedback. In other systems, negative feedback loops and other hormones play a much larger role. ADH isn't the only hormone here though. And the reason I mentioned this diagram a little while ago and the importance of it is because there's another hormone involved. If this, we'll just follow the direction of the flow of the urine that's being produced out of Bowmans capsule, down the descending loop, up the ascending loop, and distal convoluted tubule to the collecting duct. As this distal convoluted tubule passes close to the Bowmans capsule, there's a specialized tissue in here, and I'll just erase this because we don't need it right now. Specialized tissue called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. I'm going to write that one down because it's such a complicated term. Juxtaglomerular apparatus. Juxto means close to, glomerulus. So it's a special tissue that's right in here between the distal convoluted tubule and the afferent arteriole that goes into the Bowmans capsule. What this tissue does is it detects when there's low sodium in the blood. When there's low sodium in the blood, it causes a release. So here we go, low sodium causes the release of renin. Renin causes a couple of reactions in the plasma which are involved with angiotensin. Angiotensin 1, and there's also an angiotensin 2, and we don't have to get into that, the particulars of that sequence of reactions, but the effect of angiotensin is to cause an increase in another hormone. This hormone is called aldosterone. Increases aldosterone secretion by the adrenal cortex. Now remember, the adrenal gland has a cortex and a medulla, and we're just talking about aldosterone, which comes from the surface tissues, the cortex. So what adrenal cortex, or what the aldosterone does, is the aldosterone combats the low sodium concentration. So we have a negative feedback loop here. Aldosterone will increase the amount of sodium that gets recovered on the ascending side of the loop of Henle. So there's two hormones so far, this one here and ADH. There is a third hormone that plays a role in this system, and it's called ANH, atrionatriuretic hormone. And ANH is released when the blood pressure is too high. Obviously, if too high a blood pressure, you wind up with not 40, maybe 50 millimeters of mercury, and that's too much pressure in here and can cause damage to the glomerulus. So what happens here is, when that's detected, ANH causes the relaxation of these blood vessels, the dilation of these blood vessels, which reduces that blood pressure, and things can be kept normal. So that sort of wraps up the hormone topic for the urinary system. So we've got the structure, we know how it functions, we know what the hormones are, but we know also that things don't always go right. There can be problems with any system, and I'd like to mention a few of those here. Some time ago we mentioned uric acid, and uric acid, remember, is produced by the metabolism of nucleic acids, and uric acid structurally is very similar to purines, like adenine and guanine. And what happens, unfortunately, with uric acid is supposed to be excreted along with urine here, but unfortunately what can happen is it can crystallize. And if it crystallizes, it's very painful. It's a condition known as gout. So gout is often associated with people who drink particularly beer and people who eat a lot of red meats. It just seems that the the uric acid can crystallize under those circumstances. Another thing that can go wrong is kidney stones can form. The kidneys are supposed to be, you know, basically an organ with lots of tubes in them. Well, kidney stones are when then the salts can crystallize within those tubes, and you can get an accumulation of a mass of crystals, and that can be very, very painful. Particularly, you know, you can feel a little bit of flex on the kidney, and it's very painful. The glomerulus can actually get inflamed. You can have glomerularnephritis. So you get an inflammation of the glomerulus, and the tissues are actually exposed, more exposed in here. And you're not supposed to have blood cells in your urine, but it is possible with glomerularnephritis, this thing gets inflamed, and you can have additional seepage, if you like, from blood cells, and even the proteins can get into urine, and that's not very good. Incontinence. Incontinence is the inability to prevent urination when it's not convenient to urinate, and it happens sometimes with older age. The ability to control those muscles for urination diminishes, but also there can be infections in the system which can lead to incontinence, I suppose, just to say it that way. Kidney failure. Kidneys are supposed to function, but sometimes they don't function well. What happens if your kidneys are only working at 50% capacity? Well, that's not life-threatening, because you can live quite well with only one kidney. But if you have less and less of kidney function, diminished kidney function, you can wind up with a situation where the urea is not cleared from your body fast enough, and you are becoming more toxic, and you may have to have dialysis treatments to get rid of the urea in your blood. And maybe the last little comment that I can add to it is, what about little kids? What about infants that are 1 year old and they can't control their urination? The reason? They've never had to. If you think about it, the whole time they were developing as embryos, they didn't have to worry about things like that. The umbilical arteries just took the urea way back to the placenta. Here we have a situation where we've got a new system that has to function in them, and it simply takes time for the neural pathways to develop so that the infant can recognize, oh yeah, there's a need there. So it may take a couple years for a child to get control over urination. So I think that wraps it up. Thank you very much.